Today we take a closer look inside HM Prison Winchester, one of the United Kingdom's historic correctional facilities. Built during the Victorian era, this prison stands as a powerful reminder of how the criminal justice system has evolved over more than a century. HMP Winchester, located in the ancient city of Winchester, Hampshire, is one of the oldest operational prisons in the United Kingdom. Its origins date back to the mid-19th century, during the height of the Victorian era, a period marked by rapid industrialization, strict social hierarchies, and a strong focus on law, order, and discipline. The prison's construction was part of a broader Victorian initiative to reform the penal system, reflecting contemporary ideas about punishment, rehabilitation, and public morality. Unlike modern correctional facilities designed with rehabilitation as a primary goal, HMP Winchester was conceived largely as a place to contain and discipline offenders in a rigidly controlled environment. The architecture of HMP Winchester exemplifies the Victorian approach to prison design, characterized by imposing stone walls, narrow corridors, and compact cell blocks. Each architectural feature was intentional, aimed at maintaining strict surveillance and minimizing opportunities for disorder. The prison's layout includes wings arranged to facilitate supervision, with central corridors allowing officers to observe multiple cells simultaneously. This style, often referred to as the separate system, was designed to enforce isolation and encourage reflection among prisoners, although in practice it often led to psychological stress and harsh living conditions. Beyond its physical structure, HMP Winchester carries a significant historical legacy. Over the decades, the prison has housed a wide range of inmates, from petty offenders to serious criminals. Its long history provides a unique lens into how societal attitudes toward crime and punishment have evolved over time. Each era of operation, from the rigidly punitive Victorian years to the more modern approaches emphasizing rehabilitation, has left its mark on the institution, creating a layered historical narrative embedded within its walls. The prison's Victorian heritage is also evident in its operational philosophy. In the 19th century, imprisonment was viewed primarily as a moral corrective, a way to instill discipline through strict routines and labor. Prisoners at HMP Winchester would have been expected to follow strict daily schedules, including work, prayer, and exercise, with minimal personal freedom. This approach mirrored broader societal beliefs of the time, which held that strict discipline could reform even the most hardened offenders. Over time, some of these principles persisted, shaping the ethos of the prison long after the Victorian era ended. HMP Winchester's historical significance extends beyond its architecture and operational philosophy. The prison has been the site of numerous inspections, reforms, and controversies over the years, which have drawn attention to the challenges of maintaining a centuries-old facility. Victorian prisons were not built to accommodate the growing populations of modern times, and as the number of inmates increased, Winchester began to experience significant overcrowding. This historical challenge has continued into the 21st century, making HMP Winchester a case study in how historic institutions adapt, or struggle to adapt, to contemporary needs. The cultural and social impact of HMP Winchester cannot be understated. Being one of the most recognizable Victorian prisons in England, it has often been referenced in studies of British penal history, academic research on incarceration, and even local heritage projects. Its existence provides historians, criminologists, and social scientists with tangible evidence of Victorian penal philosophy in practice, allowing comparisons between past and present approaches to prison management and prisoner welfare. HMP Winchester officially opened its doors in 1849, during the heart of the Victorian era, a time when Britain was undergoing dramatic social, economic, and political transformations. The mid-19th century was marked by rapid industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of the British Empire, all of which contributed to shifting social structures and new challenges in law enforcement and public order. The opening of Winchester Prison must be understood against this backdrop, as Victorian society placed a high value on discipline, moral reform, and order, particularly in the management of criminal offenders. The construction of the prison in 1849 reflected the prevailing penal philosophies of the time. Victorian reformers believed that imprisonment should not only punish offenders, but also reform them through strict routines, labor, and moral instruction. HMP Winchester was designed to embody these principles. Its architecture and operational planning prioritized supervision, order, and control, with carefully laid out cell blocks and regimented daily schedules for prisoners. The opening of the prison thus symbolized a commitment to enforcing social norms and maintaining public safety in an era of rapid societal change. When the prison first opened, it was intended to house a relatively modest population of inmates, in keeping with the standards of mid-19th century penal facilities. Cells were small, designed for individual occupancy, and the focus was on enforcing discipline and isolation. Prisoners would engage in hard labor as part of their sentence, often performing tasks that were physically demanding and mentally monotonous. These activities were believed to instill moral reform and deter future criminal behavior. However, the principles applied during this period were far removed from modern ideas of rehabilitation or prisoner welfare. The opening of HMP Winchester in 1849 also represented the broader Victorian movement to standardize and professionalize prisons across England. Before this period, prisons were often inconsistent in their management, with conditions varying widely between locations. Winchester became part of a network of institutions designed to implement more uniform practices, overseen by the government and increasingly subject to inspections. This focus on standardization reflected the Victorian belief in rational planning, efficiency, and social improvement through structured institutions. As a new prison in 1849, Winchester also faced immediate challenges typical of Victorian-era correctional facilities. The early years required careful attention to staffing, as wardens and officers were expected to maintain strict control over inmates while enforcing rigorous routines. Training and supervision of staff were emphasized to ensure adherence to regulations, and any breaches of discipline by prisoners were met with harsh punishments, consistent with Victorian penal ideals. The opening year, therefore, set the tone for how the institution would operate for decades to come. The societal context of 1849 is critical to understanding the prison's opening. Crime rates in Victorian England were influenced by widespread poverty, rapid urban migration, and social dislocation. Prisons like HMP Winchester were part of a broader attempt to respond to these pressures. The authorities sought to separate offenders from society, instill moral discipline, and maintain social order. Opening a new, purpose-built prison during this period was seen not only as a practical necessity, but also as a moral imperative, reflecting society's belief in the corrective power of incarceration. The opening of the prison also had an impact on the local community of Winchester. While it provided employment for staff and construction workers, it also became a symbol of authority and order within the city. The presence of a Victorian prison in Hampshire represented the state's power to enforce the law and manage offenders, creating a visible reminder to residents of the consequences of criminal behavior. This dynamic between the prison and the community became a defining feature of Winchester's relationship with its surrounding population. Finally, the year 1849 marked the beginning of a long and evolving history for HMP Winchester. From its Victorian origins, the prison has weathered social reforms, changes in penal policy, and ongoing challenges such as overcrowding and aging infrastructure. Its opening during the Victorian period established both its architectural and operational foundations, many of which continue to influence the prison's function today. The historical context of its inception provides valuable insights into the philosophies, priorities, and challenges that have shaped one of England's oldest operating correctional facilities. HMP Winchester is situated in the historic city of Winchester, the former capital of England and a place with rich cultural and historical significance. The city itself is known for its ancient architecture, including the famous Winchester Cathedral, medieval streets, and Roman heritage. Placing a Victorian prison in such a historically significant city was both practical and symbolic, highlighting the government's intent to enforce law and order within a prominent administrative and cultural centre. The prison occupies a central location within Winchester, providing relatively easy access for transportation of inmates, legal representatives, and staff. Its positioning reflects Victorian planning priorities, where proximity to local courts and administrative offices was crucial for efficient operations. This location allowed for regular movement of prisoners to court hearings and facilitated communication with the authorities overseeing the prison's management. The central placement also symbolized the presence of state authority within the heart of the city. Winchester's geography influenced the design and function of the prison. Surrounded by historic buildings and narrow streets, the prison had to be integrated carefully into the urban landscape. Victorian architects constructed the facility with thick stone walls and high fences to ensure security, while fitting within the existing city layout. Its location on elevated ground allowed for better observation and surveillance, ensuring that guards could monitor both the prison grounds and surrounding areas effectively. The city of Winchester itself has long been associated with law and governance. As a former capital of England, it has housed courts, administrative offices, and law enforcement agencies for centuries. By situating a prison here, authorities reinforced the city's role as a centre of legal and judicial activity. The presence of HMP Winchester not only addressed the need for inmate containment, but also served as a statement of civic order, reminding residents and visitors alike of the consequences of criminal behaviour. HMP Winchester's location also affects the daily lives of both staff and inmates. Its placement within an established urban area means that officers, administrators, and support staff often live locally, fostering a close connection between the prison and the wider community. Similarly, visitors, lawyers, and social workers benefit from the accessible location, making family visits and official interactions more feasible. This urban integration, however, also presents challenges, as the prison must maintain security and privacy while operating amid the activity of city life. The surrounding area of Winchester contributes to the prison's unique character. The city's historic streets, green spaces, and architectural landmarks provide a contrasting backdrop to the austere stone walls of the prison. This juxtaposition highlights the tension between Victorian-era punitive ideals and the cultural richness of the city. The historic environment adds both symbolic weight and practical constraints, as modern expansions or renovations must respect Winchester's heritage while addressing the functional needs of a contemporary correctional facility. Being located in Hampshire also places the prison within a broader regional network of correctional institutions. HMP Winchester is part of the county's approach to managing offenders, balancing populations among facilities, and coordinating with local law enforcement and judicial systems. Its location within a relatively rural yet historically significant county means that it serves a diverse population of inmates, including those from urban centres, smaller towns, and surrounding rural areas, further complicating management and rehabilitation efforts. Finally, the location of HMP Winchester in Winchester, Hampshire, anchors the prison within a historical, cultural, and administrative context. Its urban placement, integration with the city's infrastructure, and symbolic presence as a Victorian institution all contribute to its significance. The site not only facilitated operational efficiency, but also reinforced the ideals of authority, law, and moral oversight central to Victorian penal philosophy. Its positioning continues to influence both the daily functioning of the prison and its perception by the public, making the location an essential aspect of its identity and historical legacy. HMP Winchester is a quintessential example of Victorian prison architecture, designed to reflect the rigid social and moral philosophies of the 19th century. The prison was built with thick stone walls, narrow corridors, and heavy iron gates, all intended to create an environment of discipline, control, and surveillance. Each architectural feature was carefully chosen to enforce order and prevent escapes, embodying the era's belief that physical structure could influence behavior. The layout of the prison follows the separate system, a design popular in the Victorian period. This system emphasized isolating prisoners in individual cells to encourage reflection and penitence. Cell blocks were arranged so that guards could observe multiple areas at once, often from a central vantage point, allowing for constant surveillance. The architecture itself became a tool of control, with walls and corridors dictating the movement of prisoners and minimizing opportunities for interaction that might lead to disorder. The cells at HMP Winchester were deliberately small and austere, reflecting the Victorian emphasis on discipline and moral reform. Prisoners typically had just enough space for a bed, a small table, and minimal personal belongings. The intention was to limit comfort, instill a sense of confinement, and encourage contemplation of their crimes. These tight spaces, however, contributed to stress, tension, and overcrowding issues in later years, highlighting the long-term limitations of such strict architectural choices. High ceilings, narrow windows, and strategically placed ventilation were also part of the design, balancing the need for light and air with the necessity of maintaining security. While prisoners could see some daylight, the heavy iron bars and limited visibility reinforced the sense of separation from the outside world. Every element of the structure served both practical and symbolic purposes. It ensured security while continuously reminding inmates of their restricted freedom. The Victorian architects of HMP Winchester also included separate areas for work, exercise, and communal activities, but even these spaces were regimented. Exercise yards were enclosed and monitored, and workshops were designed to channel labor in productive yet controlled ways. The emphasis was on structured routines, ensuring that every hour of a prisoner's day was accounted for, with minimal opportunity for idleness or rebellion. The architecture facilitated this rigid schedule, integrating discipline into both private and public areas of the prison. Another feature characteristic of 19th-century design was the use of imposing facades and intimidating entrances. The exterior of HMP Winchester projects authority and control, with high stone walls, a grand gatehouse, and symmetrical design elements that communicate power and order. These visual cues were meant to deter potential offenders and reinforce the societal message that crime would be met with strict containment and moral correction. The architecture also reflects an understanding of human psychology, albeit through a Victorian lens. Isolated cells, limited social interaction, and constant observation were intended to instill a sense of remorse and self-reflection. However, modern studies show that such designs often led to psychological strain and contributed to tension among inmates. Despite these consequences, the layout and design of HMP Winchester remain a historical snapshot of Victorian penal philosophy, demonstrating the era's reliance on architecture as a tool for moral reform. Finally, the enduring structure of HMP Winchester highlights the long-term influence of Victorian design on modern prison operations. Many of the original cell blocks, corridors, and observation points are still in use today, shaping how the prison functions even in the 21st century. The architecture stands as both a functional environment and a historical record, illustrating how Victorian ideas about discipline, punishment, and moral correction were literally built into the walls of one of England's oldest prisons. During the Victorian era, prisons like HMP Winchester were designed primarily as instruments of punishment and moral correction, rather than centers for rehabilitation. Society at the time believed that crime was a reflection of personal failings and moral weakness. The state's role was to enforce discipline, deter criminal behavior, and instill a sense of responsibility through strict confinement. This philosophy shaped every aspect of prison life, from daily routines to architectural design. Punishment in Victorian prisons was both physical and psychological. Inmates were subjected to strict schedules, hard labor, and minimal personal comfort. Cells were deliberately small and austere, offering little more than a bed and a toilet. Solitary confinement was common, and prisoners were expected to spend long hours in silence. This approach was intended to enforce obedience and encourage reflection on their crimes, but it often resulted in mental stress and tension, particularly in overcrowded conditions. Discipline was enforced through rigid rules and strict supervision. Prisoners were required to follow set routines, which included waking, working, eating, and sleeping at fixed times. Any deviation from the rules was met with punishment, ranging from loss of privileges to solitary confinement. The use of punishment as a behavioral tool reflected the Victorian belief that structure and authority could reform individuals. Guards played a central role in maintaining this discipline, acting as both enforcers and symbols of state power within the prison walls. Labour was a cornerstone of Victorian prison discipline. Prisoners at HMP Winchester would have been assigned physically demanding tasks, such as breaking stones, cleaning, or other industrial work. Labour was seen not only as a form of punishment, but also as a way to instill a work ethic and provide practical skills. The routine of work was strict, with limited breaks and continuous supervision, reinforcing the notion that obedience and productivity were inseparable from moral improvement. Victorian prisons also emphasized moral and religious instruction as part of discipline. Inmates were encouraged, or sometimes required, to attend religious services and participate in moral education programs. Chaplains played a key role in delivering sermons and lessons designed to cultivate repentance, humility, and personal reform. The philosophy was that by combining strict punishment with moral guidance, prisoners could be corrected both physically and spiritually. Surveillance was another essential tool for maintaining discipline. Guards patrolled the corridors and monitored prisoners constantly, ensuring that rules were obeyed. The architecture of HMP Winchester facilitated this system, with long corridors and strategically placed observation points. The constant presence of authority figures was meant to reinforce the consequences of disobedience and create an environment in which rule following became habitual. Victorian prison discipline was also closely linked to social class and moral judgment. Society viewed the working-class criminal as someone needing strict control, whereas wealthier individuals were sometimes treated with more leniency. HMP Winchester, like many Victorian prisons, reflected these societal attitudes, ensuring that punishment was both a deterrent and a reflection of moral authority. This reinforced the idea that crime was not just illegal, but also morally wrong and socially unacceptable. Finally, the focus on punishment and discipline in Victorian prisons left a long-lasting legacy on facilities like HMP Winchester. While modern prisons have shifted toward rehabilitation, education, and prisoner welfare, the foundations laid in the 19th century, rigid routines, structured labour, and strict supervision, still influence operations today. The Victorian philosophy of using confinement as both a corrective and a moral instrument is embedded in the very walls, corridors, and operational practices of HMP Winchester, serving as a historical reminder of an era when punishment and discipline dominated prison life. That HMP Winchester holds the distinction of being one of the oldest operational prisons in England, with a history spanning over 170 years. Its long-standing operation provides a unique perspective on the evolution of the British penal system, bridging the gap between Victorian-era practices and contemporary correctional methods. Few prisons in the country can claim such continuity, making Winchester an important historical and functional institution in the UK's criminal justice system. The prison's age is evident in its architectural features, many of which date back to the 19th century. Original stonework, heavy iron gates, and narrow cell blocks remain in use, providing a tangible connection to the Victorian period. Despite modernization efforts in some areas, much of the prison still retains its historic character, making it not only a functioning correctional facility, but also a living museum of penal history. Visitors and researchers can observe firsthand how Victorian-era design continues to shape contemporary prison life. Operating for so long has also meant that HMP Winchester has witnessed significant historical events and social changes. From the expansion of Britain's legal system and reforms in prison labour to shifts in sentencing practices, Winchester has been at the forefront of implementing policy changes. Its long history allows it to serve as a case study for understanding how prisons have adapted, or struggle to adapt, to evolving expectations regarding inmate welfare, rehabilitation, and security. The continuity of operations also highlights the challenges of maintaining an aging facility. While the prison remains functional, its Victorian construction poses limitations for modern management. Small cells, limited communal spaces, and outdated plumbing systems make it difficult to meet contemporary standards for living conditions, rehabilitation programs, and staff working conditions. Despite these challenges, Winchester continues to operate, balancing historical preservation with practical needs. Being one of the oldest prisons has also contributed to its reputation and notoriety. Over the decades, HMP Winchester has been the subject of numerous inspections, media reports, and public debates about prison conditions. Its longevity has made it a symbol of both endurance and controversy, reflecting broader societal concerns about overcrowding, staff pressures, and the treatment of inmates. The prison's historical significance amplifies the scrutiny it receives from oversight bodies and the public. The long operational history of Winchester has allowed it to accumulate institutional knowledge and traditions that are rare in more recently built prisons. Staff and administrators have developed procedures and routines that have been refined over decades, combining historical practices with modern corrections philosophy. This continuity can be beneficial in maintaining security and order, as well as in mentoring new staff in the unique challenges of operating a historic facility. HMP Winchester's age also underscores the relationship between historic architecture and penal policy. Many reforms in the British prison system, such as the introduction of rehabilitation programs, educational classes, and mental health services, must be adapted to fit the constraints of a 19th-century building. The prison's longevity has required creative solutions to modern challenges, highlighting the complex interplay between history and contemporary correctional practice. Finally, the fact that HMP Winchester remains operational today emphasizes the enduring role of historic institutions in modern society. While many Victorian prisons have been closed, demolished, or repurposed, Winchester continues to house inmates, providing a unique continuity in England's penal landscape. Its long operational history offers lessons in resilience, adaptation, and the persistent challenge of balancing historical preservation with modern correctional standards, making it both a living institution and a historical landmark. Overcrowding has been a significant and persistent issue at HMP Winchester throughout much of its modern history. Originally designed to accommodate a relatively small number of inmates in individual cells, the prison has often faced population levels far exceeding its intended capacity. This mismatch between design and actual usage has created ongoing challenges for both inmates and staff, affecting safety, living conditions, and the overall effectiveness of the facility. The physical structure of HMP Winchester, with its Victorian-era cells, was never intended for multiple occupants. Despite this, periods of high demand have led to situations where 2 or even 3 prisoners are confined to a single cell. This forced proximity contributes to tension, conflict, and stress among inmates, making it more difficult for staff to maintain order and discipline. Overcrowding amplifies the challenges of daily life in a historic prison with limited space and resources. Beyond the immediate stress on inmates, overcrowding also increases the workload and pressure on prison staff. Officers are required to supervise a larger number of individuals than was originally intended, heightening the risk of conflict and reducing the effectiveness of rehabilitation and support programs. Staff shortages and high prisoner-to-officer ratios exacerbate these pressures, making it more challenging to ensure safety, security, and compliance with regulations. Overcrowding at Winchester has also been linked to health and hygiene concerns. Shared facilities, including toilets, showers, and communal areas, can become strained under high population levels. Limited access to clean and safe living spaces can lead to physical and mental health issues for prisoners, which in turn places additional pressure on healthcare services within the prison. The historic infrastructure was not built to handle such demands, making the problem more acute. Inspections by Inspectorate of Prisons have repeatedly highlighted overcrowding as a critical concern at Winchester. Reports have noted that cramped conditions, combined with aging facilities, compromise both prisoner welfare and staff effectiveness. The findings have led to recommendations for population reduction, infrastructure improvement, and better resource allocation, yet overcrowding remains a recurring challenge due to broader systemic pressures in the UK prison system. Overcrowding also affects rehabilitation and education programs within the prison. Limited space for classrooms, workshops, and recreational areas can restrict access to learning opportunities and vocational training, which are essential for preparing inmates for reintegration into society. When too many prisoners compete for limited resources, the effectiveness of these programs is reduced, undermining one of the key objectives of modern corrections. The problem of overcrowding at HMP Winchester reflects broader trends in the British penal system. Rising crime rates, stricter sentencing policies, and the reliance on incarceration as a primary response to crime have all contributed to pressures on historic prisons. Facilities like Winchester, with their fixed architectural constraints, are particularly vulnerable to these pressures, demonstrating the difficulty of adapting 19th-century structures to meet 21st-century needs. Finally, overcrowding underscores the tension between historical preservation and modern operational requirements. While HMP Winchester's Victorian architecture is of historical and cultural significance, it limits the ability to expand or redesign cells to meet contemporary standards. The combination of high population levels and aging infrastructure continues to pose one of the most pressing and complex challenges for the management of this historic prison, affecting every aspect of daily operations and prisoner welfare. One of the most persistent challenges at HMP Winchester stems from the fact that cells originally designed for a single prisoner are often occupied by two inmates. This situation arises largely because of long-term overcrowding, a problem common to many historic prisons in the United Kingdom. While the original Victorian design prioritized isolation and reflection, the modern reality of increasing prisoner populations has forced authorities to double up inmates in confined spaces. The physical dimensions of the cells were modest, reflecting Victorian ideas about austerity and discipline. Each cell typically contained a small bed, a toilet, and minimal space for personal belongings. The addition of a second occupant significantly reduces personal space, making it difficult for prisoners to move freely, store belongings, or maintain privacy. This lack of space can lead to discomfort and stress, impacting both physical and mental well-being. Double occupancy also creates psychological challenges. Prisoners are forced to share space with someone they may not know, sometimes with conflicting personalities or behavioral tendencies. Tensions can escalate quickly in such confined quarters, increasing the likelihood of arguments, aggression, or other forms of conflict. Staff must constantly monitor these situations to prevent incidents from escalating into violence, adding another layer of operational complexity. The impact on daily routines is also significant. Shared cells can make sleeping, eating, and working in confined areas more difficult. Inmates must coordinate activities like using the toilet or sitting on the bed, which can create friction and strain relationships. Even simple tasks, such as reading or writing, can become challenging when privacy is compromised, undermining the opportunity for reflection and personal development that the original single-cell design intended. In addition to tension between inmates, health and hygiene concerns arise in double-occupied cells. Shared spaces increase the risk of spreading illness, and limited ventilation or sanitary facilities can exacerbate these issues. The historic infrastructure of Winchester, with its small, narrow cells, was never intended to accommodate multiple people, making it harder to maintain acceptable hygiene standards for a growing population. Double occupancy also limits the effectiveness of rehabilitation and education programs. Inmates living in cramped conditions may be less able to focus on learning or participate in personal development activities. The stress of close confinement can reduce engagement in workshops, vocational training, or counseling sessions, limiting opportunities for reform and preparation for life after release. The problem of two inmates in a single cell also reflects broader systemic challenges within the UK prison system. Historic prisons like Winchester were not built to handle modern populations, yet closing or expanding such institutions is complicated by heritage protections, urban location, and funding constraints. Authorities are often forced to make compromises, prioritizing containment over comfort, which leads to shared cells as a necessary, though imperfect, solution. Finally, shared cells at HMP Winchester illustrate the tension between historic design and modern needs. While the Victorian vision emphasized isolation as a path to moral correction, modern realities of overcrowding and rising inmate numbers make single occupancy impossible in many cases. This clash between past ideals and present pressures continues to shape daily life in the prison, influencing both prisoner experience and staff management practices, and highlighting the ongoing challenge of operating a historic facility in the 21st century. Overcrowding at HMP Winchester has profound effects on the daily lives of inmates, with the most immediate impact being increased tension within the prison. When cells built for one person are shared by two or more, personal space is drastically reduced, and the lack of privacy can heighten feelings of frustration and anxiety. Prisoners are forced into close quarters with strangers, sometimes with very different personalities, habits, or temperaments, creating an environment ripe for conflict. Conflict often arises from competing needs and limited resources. Shared cells require inmates to negotiate the use of beds, furniture, and facilities such as toilets and sinks. Simple daily activities, like sleeping, studying, or eating, become points of friction. In some cases, prisoners may struggle to coexist peacefully, leading to verbal disputes, threats, or even physical altercations. The small cell size amplifies these conflicts, as there is no escape or private space for cooling down. Overcrowding also exacerbates mental stress. Prisoners living in cramped and noisy conditions experience higher levels of anxiety, frustration, and depression. The inability to control personal space, combined with the constant presence of others, can cause sleep disturbances, irritability, and emotional strain. For some inmates, these conditions increase the likelihood of psychological issues, which may require additional support from mental health professionals. Shared spaces can also fuel hostility and resentment. Inmates may perceive unequal treatment regarding work assignments, privileges, or access to communal resources. This perceived unfairness can escalate tensions, especially when combined with the stresses of confinement. In extreme cases, long-standing grudges between cellmates may develop, contributing to an ongoing cycle of conflict within the prison. The effects of overcrowding are not limited to individual cells. They also impact the broader prison population and communal areas. Exercise yards, workshops, and dining halls can become crowded and chaotic, making supervision more difficult and increasing the potential for disputes. Staff must be vigilant in monitoring both cells and shared spaces to prevent confrontations from escalating into violence, which adds pressure on already stretched personnel. Overcrowding also interferes with rehabilitation and social programs. Inmates under stress may be less inclined to participate in education, vocational training, or counseling sessions. High tension can create an atmosphere of mistrust and fear, reducing engagement in activities designed to prepare prisoners for life after release. In effect, overcrowding undermines one of the key goals of modern corrections: rehabilitation and reintegration. Staff at HMP Winchester face additional challenges in managing conflict and maintaining order. Officers must mediate disputes, enforce rules, and respond to incidents that arise from the pressures of close confinement. The constant need for intervention can strain staff resources and increase the risk of burnout, affecting overall security and the quality of prison management. Overcrowding therefore creates a ripple effect, impacting both inmates and staff. Finally, the tension, conflict, and stress generated by overcrowding illustrate a fundamental challenge of operating a historic prison in modern times. While HMP Winchester was designed for a smaller population, today it must accommodate far more inmates than originally intended. This mismatch between design and reality intensifies human stress and highlights the difficulties of balancing historic preservation, security, and humane treatment in one of England's oldest operational prisons. HMP Winchester accommodates a diverse inmate population, including a significant number of short-term and remand prisoners. Short-term prisoners are typically those serving sentences of less than a year, often for minor offences or first-time crimes. Remand prisoners, on the other hand, are individuals awaiting trial or sentencing, who have not yet been convicted. This mix of inmates presents unique operational and management challenges for the prison. Short-term prisoners often experience the prison environment differently than long-term inmates. Because their sentences are limited, these prisoners may have less time to adjust to the routines and restrictions of prison life. They often face the stress of rapidly adapting to confinement while simultaneously planning for release, which can create a sense of urgency and anxiety. This can also influence their behavior, making them more reactive to conflicts or challenges within the prison. Remand prisoners add another layer of complexity. These inmates are in a state of legal uncertainty, unsure of whether they will be convicted or released. This uncertainty can heighten emotional stress and tension as they navigate court appearances, legal consultations, and the pressures of incarceration. The transient nature of remand populations also makes planning for rehabilitation or education programs more difficult, as these inmates may be released before completing structured activities. The presence of short-term and remand prisoners contributes to the constant flux of the prison population. Unlike long-term inmates, who remain in the system for years and adapt to its routines, remand and short-term prisoners often arrive and depart in rapid cycles. This continual turnover creates operational challenges for staff, including intake processing, risk assessment, and allocation of cells, particularly in a facility already affected by overcrowding. Management of short-term and remand inmates requires tailored approaches. Remand prisoners, for example, need access to legal resources, support for court appearances, and programs that help them navigate the uncertainty of pre-trial detention. Short-term prisoners benefit from intensive preparation for release, including education, vocational training, and support services. Balancing these needs within a historic and overcrowded facility adds pressure on both staff and infrastructure. The mix of inmate types also affects social dynamics within the prison. Remand prisoners may have different routines and privileges than sentenced inmates, which can create tension if resources are perceived as unequally distributed. Similarly, short-term inmates may struggle to integrate into existing groups or programs, particularly when cellmates have longer sentences and established routines. Staff must carefully manage these interactions to maintain order and reduce conflicts. In addition, the presence of short-term and remand prisoners influences the focus of prison programs. While long-term inmates may benefit from extended vocational and educational opportunities, those with shorter stays require rapid interventions and support. Remand prisoners, being uncertain about their future, often need psychological and emotional support to cope with the stress of awaiting trial. Winchester must therefore balance long-term rehabilitation with immediate needs, a task complicated by its historic infrastructure. Finally, housing short-term and remand prisoners at HMP Winchester highlights the adaptability required of a historic Victorian prison. The original design and operational philosophy did not anticipate high volumes of transient inmates, yet modern corrections practice demands flexibility and responsiveness. Balancing security, inmate welfare, and access to programs within the constraints of a 19th-century building remains a daily challenge for staff, underscoring the ongoing tension between historical legacy and contemporary prison management. One of the defining operational challenges at HMP Winchester is the frequent turnover of its inmate population. Because the prison houses both remand prisoners awaiting trial and short-term sentenced inmates, the number and composition of prisoners fluctuate constantly. This ongoing change affects everything from cell allocation to program planning and requires continuous adaptation by the prison staff. Remand prisoners, who may stay only a few weeks or months, contribute significantly to this dynamic. Their release, transfer to other facilities, or movement following court decisions occurs on a near-daily basis. This constant flow means that staff must frequently assess risks, update records, and accommodate new arrivals, all while managing the needs of long-term inmates whose routines remain more stable. Short-term prisoners also add to population volatility. Because their sentences are brief, these inmates often cycle in and out of the prison quickly. Programs designed for rehabilitation, education, or vocational training may be interrupted or underutilized if a prisoner is released before completing them. The transient nature of these populations makes it difficult for the prison to maintain continuity in activities and ensure that resources are used efficiently. Frequent changes in population can also impact social dynamics within the prison. Inmates are constantly adjusting to new cellmates and neighbors, which can increase tension or disrupt existing social hierarchies. Staff must monitor interactions carefully to prevent disputes or bullying, especially when new arrivals are unfamiliar with the routines, rules, or culture of the prison. Maintaining order in such a fluid environment requires vigilance and adaptability. The rapid turnover also has operational consequences for healthcare and mental health services. Every new prisoner must undergo medical assessments, screenings for mental health needs, and evaluations for ongoing treatments. The short stay of many inmates can strain healthcare resources, as continuity of care becomes challenging. Ensuring that all prisoners receive proper attention despite constant population changes is a critical concern for prison administrators. Additionally, frequent population changes affect resource allocation. Meals, bedding, uniforms, and educational materials must be adjusted regularly to match the number of inmates. Overcrowding complicates this further, as small fluctuations in population can have an outsized impact on available facilities. Staff must constantly balance limited resources to meet both the fluctuating population and minimum standards for living conditions. The fluctuation of inmates also affects security and risk management. New arrivals may have unknown behavioral histories or pose security risks, requiring careful monitoring and classification. The presence of unfamiliar inmates in shared cells can lead to disputes or even incidents of violence, particularly in a prison already dealing with overcrowding. Staff must adapt security measures continuously to maintain safety for both prisoners and themselves. Finally, the frequent changes in population highlight the challenges of operating a historic prison in a modern justice system. HMP Winchester was designed in the Victorian era for a more static and controlled inmate population. Adapting this centuries-old infrastructure to manage constantly shifting populations requires flexibility, planning, and innovation. The ever-changing makeup of the prison underscores the ongoing tension between historic design limitations and the realities of contemporary incarceration. HMP Winchester's historic Victorian design, while architecturally significant, presents major obstacles to modernization and adaptation. The prison's stone walls, narrow corridors, and compact cell blocks were built for a 19th-century approach to incarceration, emphasizing punishment and isolation rather than rehabilitation, technology, or comfort. Updating such a structure to meet contemporary standards is both costly and technically challenging. The original construction materials and layout impose physical limitations. Thick stone walls, small windows, and limited floor space make it difficult to install modern plumbing, electrical systems, or heating and cooling infrastructure. Any attempt to retrofit these systems must consider structural integrity, which significantly increases construction costs and complexity compared to newer facilities designed with modernization in mind. Space constraints also hinder the creation of rehabilitation and educational areas. Modern prison programs often require classrooms, workshops, gyms, and counseling spaces to support rehabilitation. In a Victorian prison like Winchester, existing cell blocks and corridors leave little room for these additions. Expanding facilities is further complicated by the prison's urban location, which limits the ability to add new buildings or outdoor areas. Safety and security upgrades present another set of challenges. While modern prisons use surveillance technology, electronic access controls, and advanced alarm systems, installing these features in an old building requires careful planning. Wiring, camera placement, and secure network integration must work around stone walls, narrow passages, and historical features, often requiring custom solutions that are more expensive and time-consuming than in modern facilities. The age of the infrastructure also affects maintenance and operational efficiency. Aging plumbing, heating, and electrical systems frequently break down, and repairs must be conducted without compromising the structural integrity of the Victorian construction. Similarly, the floors, staircases, and cell doors require continuous upkeep, as the original materials wear over time and were not designed for the high volumes of modern inmate populations. Historical preservation adds another layer of complexity. HMP Winchester is a heritage site, meaning that significant alterations to the architecture may be restricted. Efforts to modernize the facility must strike a balance between improving functionality and preserving the historical character of the building. This requirement often limits the scope of renovations or necessitates compromises in design and implementation. The constraints of old infrastructure also impact staff operations. Narrow corridors, small offices, and cramped monitoring areas can hinder efficient supervision and administration. Modern security protocols, such as rapid lockdown systems or surveillance hubs, must be adapted to fit within the confines of the original Victorian design. Staff must operate in a space that was never intended for contemporary correctional demands, which can increase workload and stress. Finally, the difficulty of modernizing HMP Winchester underscores the broader tension between history and practicality. While the prison serves as a living monument to Victorian penal philosophy, it also struggles to meet the expectations of 21st-century corrections, including humane living conditions, rehabilitation programs, and safety standards. Each modernization effort must navigate this delicate balance, reflecting the ongoing challenge of operating a historic prison in a modern justice system. HMP Winchester has a long history of prison inspections, many of which have sparked controversy due to the facility's age, overcrowding, and conditions. These inspections are typically conducted by HM Inspectorate of Prisons to evaluate safety, living conditions, staff performance, and prisoner welfare. While inspections are intended to ensure accountability, the results often draw public attention and debate, highlighting the challenges of running a historic prison in a modern context. Controversies often arise because the prison struggles to meet contemporary standards. Inspectors frequently note issues such as overcrowded cells, outdated facilities, and limited access to rehabilitation programs. While these problems are systemic and not entirely within the control of the prison staff, the reports can generate criticism from politicians, media, and advocacy groups, placing Winchester under intense scrutiny. Staff at HMP Winchester often face difficult working conditions, which are highlighted during inspections. Narrow corridors, high inmate-to-staff ratios, and cramped offices make supervision and administration more challenging. Critics sometimes interpret these conditions as mismanagement, even though they result largely from structural limitations and historical design rather than personnel performance. This tension between perception and reality fuels controversy surrounding inspection reports. Prisoners themselves sometimes dispute inspection findings, arguing that reports fail to capture the daily realities of life behind bars. Some inmates feel that inspectors focus too heavily on physical conditions or compliance metrics without adequately considering social dynamics, stress, or mental health challenges. This disconnect between official assessments and inmate experiences contributes to the controversial nature of inspections. Media coverage often amplifies the controversy. Reports highlighting deficiencies at Winchester attract public attention and can influence debates on prison policy, funding, and sentencing practices. Headlines emphasizing overcrowding, poor facilities, or prisoner complaints can create a perception of crisis, even when staff are working diligently to manage long-standing issues within the limitations of a historic prison. Another source of controversy is the disparity between Victorian design and modern expectations. Inspectors may criticize the small cells, limited communal spaces, and outdated infrastructure, yet the prison's historic architecture makes it nearly impossible to fully meet contemporary standards. This structural mismatch often leads to public debate over whether the facility should continue operating, be renovated, or even replaced. Inspection controversies also highlight systemic challenges in the broader prison system. Many issues identified at Winchester, such as overcrowding, short-term prisoner management, and limited rehabilitation programs, reflect national trends rather than failures unique to the prison. Nevertheless, Winchester frequently becomes a focal point for criticism because its age and historic design exacerbate these problems, making them more visible during evaluations. Finally, controversial inspections at HMP Winchester serve as a reminder of the delicate balance between accountability, history, and practicality. While oversight is essential to ensure prisoner welfare and staff performance, inspections also expose the tensions inherent in operating a centuries-old prison. The debates sparked by these reports reflect broader societal questions about the role of historic prisons, resource allocation, and the challenges of maintaining safety, security, and humane conditions in a facility designed for a very different era. HMP Winchester has frequently been criticized for issues related to prisoner welfare, reflecting the challenges of operating a historic Victorian facility in modern times. Concerns often focus on overcrowding, cramped cells, limited access to programs, and the mental and physical health of inmates. These criticisms highlight the tension between maintaining a centuries-old institution and meeting contemporary expectations for humane treatment. One of the primary welfare concerns is overcrowded and confined living conditions. Cells designed for a single prisoner are often shared by 2 or more inmates, reducing personal space and privacy. This situation can increase stress, anxiety, and the likelihood of interpersonal conflict. Living in such conditions over extended periods can have a negative impact on both mental and physical health, drawing significant attention from oversight bodies and advocacy groups. Another area of criticism is limited access to rehabilitation and educational programs. While modern prisons focus on preparing inmates for reintegration into society, the constraints of Winchester's infrastructure make it difficult to provide sufficient classrooms, workshops, or vocational training spaces. Short-term and remand prisoners, in particular, may have limited opportunities to benefit from these programs due to the transient nature of their sentences. Health care and mental health services have also been under scrutiny. With a high inmate population and limited facilities, ensuring timely medical attention and support for mental well-being can be challenging. Overcrowding amplifies these difficulties, as staff must manage more patients than the original design intended. Inspections have repeatedly highlighted that delays or lack of access to essential services can compromise prisoner welfare. The prison has also faced criticism regarding exercise and recreational opportunities. Victorian design prioritized confinement and labor over leisure, meaning exercise yards are small, enclosed, and shared by many inmates. Limited access to physical activity can negatively impact both physical health and stress levels. Prisoners may feel frustration or resentment when they cannot access recreational spaces regularly, contributing to overall welfare concerns. Staffing pressures further affect welfare. High inmate-to-officer ratios make it difficult for staff to provide adequate supervision, support, and guidance. Officers may be forced to prioritize security over individual welfare, leading to situations where prisoners' emotional and social needs are not fully addressed. This operational reality has been cited in multiple reports criticizing the prison's ability to safeguard well-being. Prisoner welfare criticism at Winchester is also tied to its aging infrastructure. Outdated plumbing, heating, and ventilation systems can create uncomfortable living conditions, particularly during extreme weather. Combined with cramped cells and overcrowding, these structural limitations can make daily life harsh and contribute to complaints about overall living standards. Finally, criticism of prisoner welfare at HMP Winchester underscores a broader challenge facing historic prisons. Balancing the preservation of Victorian architecture with modern standards of humane treatment remains an ongoing struggle. While authorities have made some improvements, systemic constraints and the building's age continue to impact conditions. The persistent focus on welfare issues highlights the need for careful management, innovative solutions, and ongoing monitoring to ensure that prisoner well-being is protected within a centuries-old institution. HMP Winchester has a long and complex history of housing both male and female prisoners, reflecting the evolving needs of the British penal system. In the Victorian era, prisons were often segregated by gender, but Winchester occasionally accommodated female inmates, particularly when space in other facilities was limited. This dual usage highlights the flexibility and the challenges of managing a historic prison with constrained infrastructure. The presence of female inmates in a primarily male institution required separate facilities and careful management. Victorian penal philosophy emphasized strict segregation, meaning women were typically housed in distinct cell blocks, with separate exercise yards and work areas. Guards and staff had to be specially assigned to ensure that men and women did not interact inappropriately, adding layers of complexity to daily operations. Female prisoners often faced different conditions and treatment compared to their male counterparts. They were typically assigned domestic work, such as laundry, sewing, or kitchen duties, reflecting contemporary gender expectations. These labor assignments were intended to instill discipline and provide useful skills, but they also reinforced societal norms about women's roles, highlighting a distinct approach to incarceration based on gender. Male inmates, by contrast, were more likely to engage in industrial labor or physically demanding tasks, consistent with Victorian ideas of punishment and moral reform. The coexistence of male and female prisoners within the same institution required careful scheduling and monitoring to prevent conflicts or breaches of segregation. This dual-purpose use illustrates both the practical challenges and societal attitudes of the time. Housing both genders also had implications for rehabilitation and moral instruction. Chaplains and prison staff had to tailor their guidance to reflect gender-specific concerns, reinforcing moral lessons and expectations according to Victorian social norms. Women and men often participated in separate educational and religious programs, emphasizing different skills and moral training aligned with contemporary views of proper conduct. The historic use of both male and female prisoners also highlights space constraints and operational challenges. With a fixed number of cells, staff, and communal areas, accommodating two populations with differing needs increased pressure on the prison's infrastructure. Overcrowding, limited facilities, and the necessity of strict segregation often made daily management more difficult, particularly during periods of high inmate intake. Over time, changes in the British penal system and population pressures led to gender-specific reallocations. As the number of female prisoners grew and more women's prisons were established, Winchester gradually became primarily male-focused. However, its historic role in housing women remains an important part of its legacy, illustrating the adaptability of a Victorian institution in response to societal needs. Finally, the historical dual use of HMP Winchester for male and female inmates provides insight into Victorian penal philosophy, gender norms, and operational flexibility. It underscores how the prison balanced moral, social, and practical considerations within its limited Victorian infrastructure. This aspect of its history continues to shape the narrative of Winchester as a facility that adapted over centuries to meet the changing requirements of England's criminal justice system.